And welcome to the Multnomah Group's May presentation and webinar addressing retirement readiness, making defined contribution plans work. Eric Daly, I'm the managing principal of the Multnomah Group and lead for tax-exempt consulting practice. A couple of housekeeping items before I jump into the presentation. I've got a relatively full presentation for you today, and you may have questions throughout the presentation. Number of attendees, the lines are muted so that we can make sure to get through the content. However, you are encouraged to submit questions throughout the presentation. And at the conclusion, we will try and address as many of those as we can. For those that we don't get to, we'll certainly make sure to follow up with a written response. So with that, I'm going to jump into today's presentation. From an agenda perspective, I want to talk a little bit about kind of the structure of retirement savings in the U.S. And how some fundamental changes both to tax law and appetite for risk and even participant behavior have driven us to a different form of retirement plan structure. Within the new structure, really the defined contribution product maybe being a product of the last 40 or so years, it has taken, I think, sponsors, plan providers, and consultants a little while to figure out how to effectively develop and nurture plans that help generate good outcomes, both as it pertains to our role as employers, but also in enabling our participants to have secure retirement. We'll talk about some plan design features, some plan services, some investment structures, and some implication needs. From our perspective, the four things that really contribute to having defined contributions plans become more effective. And then we'll talk a little bit about 5 steps to trying to modify perhaps your own plan in a way that can make it more valuable to your participant population and to your employer. The reality is that we have experienced really over the course of the last 30 years a tremendous change from defined benefit pension structures to defined contribution structures. You can see the percent population, as recently as 1980, that were exclusively by a defined contribution plan, well less than 10%. That is up to over a third of the population and growing at a very, very rapid rate. Conversely, the portion or percentage of workers covered by defined benefit plans over that same time has halved, with many plans freezing benefits to existing employees and not adding new employees over any period of time. It's been true across really the 3 primary segments. Certainly for-profit employers and corporations have been early adopters to the transition from defined benefit to defined contribution, but we've seen very similar things among the nonprofit 501c3, and maybe last to come into conformity with the change is the governmental employers. But we've seen even on the governmental, specifically college and university side, a transition away from pure pension programs to defined contribution arrangements. Causes are manyfold. Certainly portability is the one that gets talked about most frequently, although I would argue that the primary change has been the last 3, which are accounting requirements at all levels and how you manage and account for your pension programs, changes in actuarial standards that have been brought about and the level of funding that's required to maintain pension programs, as well as the volatility associated with funding those types of plans. I'll talk about the reality is that defined benefit plans aren't particularly expensive, but the volatility of that expense is very, very high. But this consequence really has been a risk transfer, the risk transfer from the employer to the employee. And ultimately, each employee is responsible for running their own individual one-person defined benefit plan. And while that has some potential advantages, it also clearly has some potential significant risks. The first being that ultimately employees who are in a defined contribution structure have a lower level of retirement readiness than do their defined benefit peers, and it's a material change. And ultimately, getting back to my point earlier on funding, defined benefit plans are not traditionally more expensive than defined contribution plans, and the primary reason being that if the average U.S. citizen lives to 74, some live longer, some live shorter, we could take the money in the pension plan that was intended for those who didn't make it to 74 and use it to pay benefits to those that live past 74. Unlike a defined contribution structure where we all have to individually assume that we're going to live well into our 70s, 80s, and 90s and ultimately accumulate enough retirement savings to pay out over that period of time. And to the extent that we die here, that's that ultimately go to our heirs, but don't ensure the retirement readiness of our peers and coworkers. So in transition from defined benefit to defined contribution, the big transfer is on the funding side. So most pension plans have historically been employer funded. Certainly there are hybrid plans where employees contribute a percentage of their income towards the funding status, but the predominant structure has been employer funded versus defined contribution, where there is a much greater share traditionally paid by employees versus employers. A big component that's reducing the retirement readiness, ultimately investment strategy. So there certainly have been a myriad of stories about employers who have done a poor job of managing their pension benefits. However, the evidence is also very, very clear that participants have done a much, much worse job in aggregate of managing investment strategy and developing returns that are reasonable given age and risk circumstance. Inflation metric, in defined benefit plan arena, participants determine how much retirement income they're going to need and work long enough to generate that outcome. So if you have a years of service formula, a percentage of pay formula, the burden on an employee is relatively low. They need to figure out what they need in income, work long enough to develop that retirement need, and can retire with relative certainty about what their income level is going to be prospectively. Defined contribution side, it is much more difficult. We're asking participants to now make reasonable assumptions about how dollars that are accumulated will transfer to income over time. And unfortunately, even the technology tools that are out there have not developed the level of comfort among participants to get them to a point where they feel like they've successfully accumulated enough for retirement. The biggest transfer has been on the plan sponsor volatility side. So while a reasonable employer defined benefit plan might cost an employer 8 to 10% of pay, fortunate circumstance is that interest rates and other market factors mean standard deviation of that 8 to 10% of wage contribution rate is very, very high. And most organizations can't afford to have a pension plan that could go anywhere from 2% of pay to 24% of pay over a short period of time. Then the defined contribution side, volatility is low. A sponsor can ultimately determine what percentage of pay they want to contribute, and the volatility on that year to year is fractions of a percent as opposed to the pension environment. But risk transfer really has been at the expense of participant safety. A participant now is managing their own individual pension plan with a desire toward generating enough that they can get to a point of retirement comfort. When we look at those four primary factors that go into the success of retirement readiness, the reality is that there are a number of behavioral finance biases that hurt the ability of participants to develop good, sustainable retirement saving strategies. Certain that is impactful most immediately is the contribution rate. While employers determine a contribution rate that they make into a defined contribution plan, when we're looking at a targeted savings rate and defined contribution of somewhere to 10 to 15%, depending on what your retirement goals are and your certain current age is, every defined contribution plan requires that employees contribute a portion of their pay in some cases a significant portion of their pay to generate that total 10 to 15% contribution rate. And it is that current moment bias eats away our ability to do that. Most participants, from a finance perspective, view their spending needs and even their savings needs in today's dollars as being more important than their retirement income needs. And as a result, the likelihood of the saving at the rate that would be necessary for them to generate a sustainable retirement in the early years is challenged by that current moment bias. On the investment return side, there's been so many studies about participant returns and the impact of participant returns on retirement outcomes. But in a participant-directed defined contribution setting, we are asking employees to make very sophisticated decisions about allocation. In some cases, giving them tools to do so. In some cases, giving them product to make that decision easier. But the reality is that the human mind works in a way that we'd see patterns where patterns don't exist. And unfortunately, our ability to identify those patterns in a stock market environment oftentimes cause us to buy into investment strategies after they've had significant upticks. I mean, for those of you that may have commodities products in your core array, look at the returns of commodities since you've decided to add that particular investment mandate. This need and this ability to see patterns where there really is only randomness actually hurt participant returns, certainly hurt participant returns when you compare them to the average pension plan over a long period of time. Time horizon, the reality is defined contribution plans really create no set of certainty or expectation related to retirement. And in fact, many plans, while they're required to have a retirement age on the defined contribution side, all the retirement age does is allow a participant who's still working to begin to take, in many cases, distributions even before they've arrived at their true retirement. Defined contribution plans also now have allowed participants to not take minimum required distributions as long as they're currently employed at 70 and a half. So many who are trying to avoid taxation are almost incented to work far beyond what a traditional retirement might be in a pension setting. And then income needs. The degree to which savers have managed their expenses has a significant impact on needs, but the reality is that we all view negativity in the news and in markets as being more important than the prospect of negativity as being far more important than the reality of what's occurring today. And as a result, when you talk to pre-retirees, their assumptions about what's going to happen are undoubtedly more negative than what recent experience over the last 2, 3, 4 decades would point out, and causes them to work far longer than you would normally expect. The transition from defined benefit to defined contribution has been very, very clear. Employees whose primary retirement is a defined contribution plan retire 1 to 2 years later than those covered by a pension plan. Employees covered by a pension plan are 87% more likely to retire in any given year. The way participants' minds work related to how comfortable they feel is significantly driven by market performance or factors that are not within their control. A 1% increase in the S&P 500 index increases the probability that a pre-retiree will retire by 2.5%. And these are going to have significant impacts prospectively. By 2020, it's estimated that 20% of the workforce is projected to be 65 and older, and that the only growth in the labor force will be among those 55 and older. And certainly will have an ability or an impact on the ability of institutions and employers to retain and promote young talent. While there are clearly employees that we want to encourage to stay and that there are risks associated with the loss of knowledge among the older workforce, but it's much easier to incent an employee to stay when they might normally retire than it is to encourage someone to retire who may no longer be productive on the employer side. And the costs are real. Workers' compensation, claim duration is 25% longer and benefit payments are 56% higher for older employees. Disability premiums are 15% higher, and instances are 42% higher among workers age 65 and older. And for those of you that are worried about the Affordable Care Act and the impact of regulatory changes on health care costs, healthcare costs for a 65-year-old worker are twice that of an employee between the ages of 45 and 54. Those costs are material, so not looking at the ability of a plan to generate retirement success for employees may be a cost today, but over the course of the next several decades, those costs will continue to increase as the baby boom population rolls through retirement age. What about retirement readiness? So just so that we're kind of level setting the conversation, the retirement readiness is the degree to which a participant is doing things necessary to generate adequate replacement income in retirement. So it's a product of their savings behaviors, the design of the plan, and their own investment returns so that they can enjoy a standard of living that's reasonable given what they've accumulated over the course of their working career. Really taking a defined contribution and flipping it over and looking at it like a pension plan. So based on these contributions and these behaviors, do we have the type of plan that for any average participant would likely generate a successful outcome? And because of the defined contribution plan, it's important to point out we guarantee that those outcomes will be good. There will always be those that despite the design and the structure of our plan don't save enough, that despite the design and structure of our plan will invest poorly. But in aggregate, and on average, are we generating the types of outcome that will allow the majority of our population to likely generate a successful retirement? And this issue is very critical now. I mean, the Department of Labor recently issued their opinion that adding retirement income calculations to quarterly benefit statements and defined contribution plans will be on their regulatory agenda for 2013 and beyond. So you're looking at this particular issue currently. It's likely that your participants over the course of the next year to two will likely have this issue presented very forcefully, either by your vendor or by the Department of Labor mandating changes in how we report data to participants. We look at defined contribution plan as kind of a three-cycle mechanism. I know that there are others who slice and dice the data differently. You know, I've seen reports that look at by age and by wage and by gender and by left-handed people versus right-handed people. But in very simplistic terms, we think there are really three types or three stages within the defined contribution setting. We have our young savers. They tend to be lower income. There is a significant competition for their income for other accumulated debts or other spending desires, and managing how we get them on a path early on in their working career to a sustainable retirement. This is a huge portion of most workforces are accumulators. They're mid-career, they're very highly productive. They have likely are concluding or have concluded some major expenses related to purchases of first homes, paying for child care for younger dependents. And we're trying to reduce their ability to damage their own retirement savings through leakage, and we'll talk about leakage later in the presentation. And then we have our pre-retirees. This is our most accomplished, our most experienced portion of our workforce. And many of the costs associated with managing a family and a household have now since passed. Maybe they've put their kids through college or not, and they are now beginning to focus on what it might likely look like to arrive at a successful retirement. So those three types of employees, we're really going to look at them through four methods, and in my estimation, in order of their importance to managing retirement success. One, a benefit plan design. This is critically the area where we as employers have the greatest ability to move the greatest number of employees from retirement adequacy to to retirement adequacy. We'll look at plan provider services. I mean, we have so long looked at defined contribution providers through the prism of what services they provide. There are services that will help move the needle, but in probably less impactful ways than design. We'll look at investment structures. I mean, clearly the gap in investment performance between your participants and broader markets is troubling, and what can we do to try and reduce that gap? And then participant education. Open education specifically as we get toward the end of our working careers and trying to help employees who have done the necessary things to generate retirement income understand the consequences of transitioning into retirement and how that might look for them. So on the saver side, as we mentioned before, nearly all defined contribution plans require an employee. And by require, I mean if they're ever going to be able to retire, they're going to have to contribute something to the defined contribution plan. Maybe there's a match which allows them to get an employer contribution, but even if there isn't, the ability to get to that targeted 10 to 15% contribution rate is going to deteriorate retirement adequacy. Obviously, the earlier they begin doing that, the less they need to save. If they start later in the process, they're probably going to have to do 15. Certainly, there are a large portion of the baby boom population that are sitting at a combined rate between employer and employee at 18, 19, 20% to try and catch up to retirement adequacy. I want to look at plan design and how ultimately do we get that young saver population to get to a 10%, 11%, 12% contribution rate that if over a working career should generate more than adequate retirement savings as long as they don't do something catastrophically detrimental on the investment side. And the three primary ways for design that we look to do that, certainly employee mandatory contributions for some of the tax-exempt entities and governmental entities. That has become a very popular plan feature. For those that don't want to make it mandatory, certainly using current moment bias and taking a look at automatic enrollment and automatic escalation, essentially making the default prospect that you will be in the plan versus requiring a young saver who may have their first job to agree to give away a percentage of their pay today in exchange for a benefit 40 years from now. And certainly looking at design formulas that encourage, by creating greater contributions, some form of matching contribution or hybrid match contribution that we'll talk about. Enrollment and escalation side, I should start with the employee mandatory contribution. The reality is that it is very difficult for plans that have not had mandatory employee contributions to add them at a later date. They are very, very impactful. They certainly move the needle more so than any other practice. But from a transition perspective, it's almost impossible for most employers that don't have some form of guaranteed benefit to require employee contributions without some dollar-for-dollar adjustment to pay to compensate for that. In those cases, it clearly can make sense, but it can be challenging. For many employers, auto-enrollment and automatic escalation get to very similar types of behaviors. So statistically, when you have these types of programs and you design them well, you should get, almost without regard to your demographic, without regard to your wage base, enrollment and participation rates that are in the high 80s. In some cases, they'll be even higher than that. So if you get participation rates that are less than level, you certainly take a look at what the prospect of automatic enrollment would be and how it would improve retirement readiness. The benefit is that it really doesn't change the contract between the participant and the plan sponsor. It changes the enrollment mechanism. It's a de-enrollment mechanism as opposed to an enrollment mechanism. And the con, traditionally, is that most employers, when they adopt automatic enrollment, do it for the next new hire. And if you're an employer that has hundreds to thousands of employees within your workforce, testing the retirement readiness of the employee you haven't hired yet, while a very productive goal, doesn't necessarily choose the effectiveness effectiveness of the current plan. That we're seeing more employers actually adopt automatic enrollment and automatic re-enrollment, meaning that we're going to go back and automatically enroll or attempt to automatically enroll all of our current employees who are saving or not saving at a rate that's consistent with the default practices. That can be more difficult. The implementation is relatively simple. There's no requirements that go along with it. And the only challenges tend to be with payroll systems. Oftentimes you'll see automatic enrollment augmented with what we call automatic escalation, which again can be an opt-out process by which participants' rate of savings is increased by 1% each year. That could be done on a calendar basis. It could be done consistent with when you have pay reviews and raises for existing employees. But it allows you to take someone who may start at a 3 or 4 or 5% deferral rate and eventually ratchet them up to a position where between employer and employee contribution rates, saving at that 10 to 15% rate that is traditionally your benchmark. Certainly adopting a hybrid match formula. So those of you who are making just straight profit sharing or straight contributions to all employees without regard to their own engagement in the savings process, the benefit of that, of course, is that it impacts everyone equally. So without regard to whether you can save, want to save, will save, everyone is receiving an employer contribution. However, there is certainly statistical evidence that would point to creating a benchmark by which participants receive a contribution by their own savings process will lead to higher rates of deferral. Traditionally, looking at a hybrid formula can get you in a position where you get the best of both worlds. So if it's every employee gets a 3% of pay contribution plus a match of 50% on the next 6%, one benefits. The degree to which they benefit, however, is targeted based on whether they are contributing to the plan and therefore furthering their own retirement readiness. Challenge, obviously, any time you change employer contribution formulas, there is the potential, unless you just add more money to your own plan, that's going to be viewed by a percentage of your population as a takeaway. So communicating the reasons, the need and the necessity to creating plans that adequate retirement readiness we think is an important one. These audit features and implementation frequency obviously vary relatively significantly depending on the type of employer you are. So on the corporate side, we see automatic enrollment rates that are close to 1/4, and we see auto increase programs that are close to 3/4. Conversely, higher education, automatic enrollment and automatic increase is less than 5%, and hospitals fall really somewhere in between. So tremendous differences in how plans are structured, but certainly taking a look at what the impact of these changes might be on improving the efficacy of your retirement plan is critical. If you're looking at your traditional non-automatic enrollment plan participation rates in the DC world, without automatic enrollment, you look at plan participation rates that are in the 50s. With automatic enrollment, you're looking at plans with participation rates in the 80s. And clearly, retirement adequacy in aggregate is impacted dramatically by participation rates that are that divergent. So plan accumulators, and what I like to say in this phase is neither R or lender B. They started, as many did in our industry, doing retirement education counseling for participants. One of the things that you would always go through is you participate in this plan. Worst case, you can get your money back out through a loan feature. It was a feature that was added, and it was perceived to be beneficial to participants because it gave them greater control and greater flexibility. And there is no doubt that it gives participants greater control, greater flexibility, but there is very little doubt that that increase in flexibility has a consequence, and the consequence, while borne by the individual participant, is also borne by the larger institution of not having employees who will be able to successfully retire. When we look at the loan and distribution feature side, there are a number of areas where we see retirement leakage for retirement accumulators. Certainly, the frequency with which we see job changes is a significant one. The General Accounting Office is very, very concerned currently about the percentage of employees that take lump sum distributions as they transition from job to job. 20% of employees who take a lump sum distribution fail to roll those into another tax-qualified IRA or retirement plan account, meaning they spend it, and as a result, their accumulations in retirement income are proportionally deteriorated. Participant ages 35 to 45 who are not yet at that point where they've accumulated significant savings are very likely to borrow, and when they do, they tend to max out how much they take. The key, of course, is if everyone paid back their loan and didn't impact or crowd out other retirement savings, loans would be relevant. But current estimated loan default rate is 17.5% for participants with loans. Your data may be higher, may be lower, but an environment where participants are laying an interest rate that's tied to prime, which is about 3.25% now. So if your prime plus 1 is your loan interest rate, participants are able to borrow money at 4.25% and are defaulting at a 17% rate. If your plan is a bank, and when you cause it to have a loan feature, essentially it is, you would be out of business relatively quickly if you lent money to borrowers at 4.25% and had 17.5% of them default. And then understood that those defaults ultimately come out of participant accumulations, but that impact on retirement income is significant. The good news is that hardship distributions, because there are times when participants need to be able to access retirement savings. But when we look at hardship distributions, most plans are experiencing participant hardship distributions that are less than 2%, usually in the low ones percent of the population on an annual basis that need to take a hardship distribution. And obviously the Internal Revenue Service has created some reasonable criteria by which you can limit how participants are taking those hardships. So buying a car is not a hardship distribution. Uninsured medical expenses obviously is. So creating at least some criteria by which participants have to evaluate the need versus the desire to spend retirement accumulations. The issue becomes more and more relevant with each passing year. Back in 2006, we were at about 15% of the population that had loans outstanding on their accounts. We're up to about 18.5%. If you do some relatively quick math on retirement accumulations, if you're a typical plan that has about 18.5% of your population with a loan, and about 17.4% of that population fails or defaults on their loan, the reality is the cost on accumulated assets is somewhere between 0.5% and 0.75% a year. So an environment where we're understandably very focused on expenses and costs, as the Department of Labor has been and plan sponsors have been, we've been able to negotiate better and better fee structures with providers over the course of the last 5 to 6 years. The impact of this particular feature on total plan assets is very infrequently measured and assessed, and it is one that will rapidly ravage plan assets over 10, 15, 20-year periods. And then design side for the pre-retiree population, really the big piece that we look at for pre-retirees is helping maintain the focus on what type of plan this is. So looking at your plan features and provisions to take a look at in-service plan distributions and early retirement windows to determine if those things are ultimately atrophying the retirement efficacy of plans. So too frequently what we see is employees who make it to age 65. At 65, the plan design makes them eligible to take distributions while still employed, and essentially using their retirement accumulations to augment their current lifestyle rather than make the transition from working years to retirement. And again, important about that from our experience and from talking to clients over the years, it's far easier to get an employee to stay who is important to the organization regardless of age and whether they're ready to retire than it is to convince someone who cannot retire because they don't have enough money and who have long since no longer been productive to the organization to leave. So developing plans that get participants to the point where now we, as the plan sponsors, have the ability to get the necessary turnover within the employment workforce that keeps organizations healthy is critical. So those service plan distributions, take a look at the frequency and the types of distributions, and is that having a material impact on retirement efficacy? Focusing on retirement and looking at in-service distribution features that are tied to some form of phased retirement program is traditionally what generates the best level of outcome. From the plan design side, what other things do we need to look at? Certainly plan services becomes a big piece of that. And the reality is, while we've sold more and more sophisticated web systems, more and more sophisticated education programs, more and more sophisticated investment menus, the reality is the majority of most workforces have a lack of comfort or sophistication with regard to retirement savings, and developing systems that allow them to be successful is ultimately what moves the needle from a retirement income and retirement readiness perspective. The most sophisticated among your employee base will optimize their outcome without regard to how you design and structure your plan. However, the least sophisticated portion of your population will be impacted dramatically by how intimidating, how difficult your enrollment process and your management process is for them to adjust to. The big piece that we look at this impact on participation rates by the expansion of investment products that are offered continues to be an informative lesson in more ways can be positive to a small percentage of our population, but actually hurt in aggregate the efficacy of our retirement plans. Investment side, understanding that, what we need to try and avoid is having investment structures that generate substandard investment returns for participants. So Dalbar does their study every year related to how participants have done in comparison to how the markets have done. Average equity investor generated a 3.83% return over the last 20 years. The S&P over that same period of time up 9%. The fixed income investor up 1%. The Barclays up 7%. Those gaps are tremendous and cannot be overcome by having even investment products that are in the top quarter or top decile. The explanation for that gap in returns is how participants go about managing, either investing or not, chasing returns or not, avoiding risk and missing returns, engaging in very risky behaviors as they get closer to retirement. All of those things generate this tremendous gap between the performance of the market and the performance of investors. And trying to increase by 1 or 2% the rate of return that participants receive in the marketplace certainly has an impact across the board on retirement income and adequacy. So product structures, I think there are 3 that most plans look at as it pertains to trying to create kind of one-stop shops for participants who may want to allocate their accounts. Managed accounts, which traditionally are quantitative-based systems that take your underlying investments and put them in portfolios that are specific to a participant based on age and information that you may know. But related to that is that for most account solutions, if you can get participants to engage and provide income on outside assets and income needs and other things, you get more fine-tuned allocation to a participant. The con is that for most of your less sophisticated participants, the likelihood of them engaging in that process and getting the amount of data out that's necessary to get you a more customized portfolio is very unlikely. And because most managed account products have a additional expense related to them, really getting what is essentially a balanced allocation but paying more for it as a result of the sophisticated tools that unfortunately the least sophisticated aren't using and taking advantage of. Target or target date products continue to grow at a very, very rapid rate. And the primary reason that they're growing at such a quick rate is that the same variables that make managed accounts very customized are required in a target maturity environment to come up with an allocation that's at least reasonable. Getting an allocation that for your average 53-year-old would be considered prudent and reasonable can be done with nothing more than a date of birth, which all employers have. Con related to target maturity products are two factors. One is that age is not the only factor that goes into what your asset allocation should be. It's a significant one, but certainly risk, income needs, your actual time horizons, all factors would play a role in how much stock versus fixed income allocation would be necessary. Second is that most target date products are built using underlying investment products from the same portfolio manager. And what can happen is you could have pieces of your target date tower that are performing poorly and making decisions about how to react and adjust portfolios can be difficult because you don't have the ability in a target date setting unless you are a large corporate employer where you can construct your own target date products to take a building block out and replace it with a better performing investment product. And then there's target risk or balanced funds. So balanced funds certainly were popular 10 and 15 years ago, and very simple one product allocation, which can be global, which can be balanced between stocks and bonds, can certainly be inexpensive if selected well. Challenge, of course, being that for our young saving population, giving them a 60-40 stock-to-bond allocation, not giving them the types of risk exposure that we would want to in the early years. And for an employee who's 65, maybe that 60-40 allocation is more aggressive than we would want it to be given their age and circumstance. We're collecting data on how well participants do within these structures and which would be most optimal to help the least sophisticated among us. Really clear is that the benefit is predominantly on the least sophisticated group. So you're looking really at just 5-year returns from a Vanguard study in 2011, looking at single target dates, managed accounts, and all other participants. And what is really, really clear is that the fit comes to, again, those that have performed at the 5th percentile and the 25th percentile. Variety of different returns is much narrower in a target date universe or a managed account universe. The variety that's experienced for those that choose their own allocations is much higher. So having some form of real allocated structure for the least sophisticated portion of the population should help boost returns for those that may not be in a position to make those decisions themselves. Beyond coming up with packaging to help least sophisticated participants, even communicating current investment menus in a way that makes it easier for participants to digest, we find preferable and drives better participant behavior. In many cases, what we're doing and recommending to clients is tiering investment menus so that even among an array of investments that, including target date products, could be 20 or 25 funds long, how do we create a structure so that participants can understand what subset of that 20 or 25 or in some cases 30 investment menu should they be looking at? Giving them that subject, again, simplifies investment decision making. So the retirement plan maintains investment flexibility, but participants are able to target much more easily the type of investment products that they're looking for. It acknowledges the difference between experience and interest from participants, and doesn't necessarily drive philosophically participants to a single type of solution and gives them some control over where they want to be. of the ways that you can do that is what we call the index tier option. So it creates 4 different types of investment structures, or 3 depending on the type of plan you have. So for your least sophisticated participants, we still maintain some form of target maturity, target risk, managed account solution that allows them to get in the plan, not make any investment decisions, and get a reasonable, diversified investment portfolio. For other participants who are merely trying to generate market-level returns, and if you go back to that Dalbar study, market-level returns look awfully good in comparison to real participant returns, coming with a very low-cost set of core index products, where a participant can say, I don't know anything about investing, but I know that I want to be 70% equities and 30% fixed income, and be able to do that with 2 investment products that have very little expense burden that would impact their returns. A more broad, active style investment menu for those participants who may be interested in international bonds and inflation-adjusted bonds, emerging market securities, or value bent, or a growth bent, or a small cap bent, or a large cap bent. The ability to create greater targeting of their particular risk exposures. And so sophisticated, we're seeing increasing utilization of brokerage windows and mutual fund windows. And whereas concerns about the risks that are associated with that, the reality is that in this environment, utilization is anemic and can help satisfy your sophisticated portion of your population, so that you can implement a more streamlined, structured, and cost-effective core index type array for the remainder of your participant population. And last but not least is education, or arguably last and least is education. And it's because education is not a tremendous benefit, but in almost all cases, and certainly statistically when you look at the data, education is really a feature. It doesn't tend to drive in a meaningful way changes in behavior. Said, there are hundreds and thousands and millions of stories about participants who have been able to sit down, get educated, and improve their retirement savings. Those tend to be anecdotal evidence that isn't supported by broader changes in education. And I think even the U.S. Social Security Administration Office, their statistical data indicate very similar phenomena, that the behavioral finance biases and other factors play a much more significant have more significant impact on the retirement savings behaviors than the efficacy of a retirement education program. In many cases, the ones who benefit from retirement education the most are your most sophisticated participants. They do engage in the process. They have a fundamental understanding of the terminology, and they get the most out of those education presentations, and be very, very powerful and informative services and benefits to employees, but it is very difficult to point to an evidence in a vendor change, education strategy change, where improving, changing, modifying the form of education in and of itself driven significant changes in behavior that were also explained robustly by other changes that were happening at the same time. With employee education, we do think that there are really 2 things that we like to point out and see in an effective retirement education program. During the enrollment process, it's certainly on focusing on education and financial literacy and de-emphasizing the importance of investment selection. And I've seen employers that have taken this de-emphasis to what I think is a reasonable conclusion. There are certainly larger plans that don't actually use the underlying names of the investment products during the education enrollment and statement process. They wrap them into their asset class, and it allows participants to focus on something other than, is the XYZ growth fund better than the XYZ value fund. So don't require education as a predecessor to participation. We want to remove any barriers to the enrollment process. We want to provide education but not make it a hoop that a participant needs to jump through to enroll. And really appreciate the importance of peer group behavior. So when you look back to the peer study, how their peers, neighbors, coworkers save and behave is very impactful, and there's a high correlation within departments, within divisions, within similar types of employer groups within the same employment setting. During relation, begin educating on some of these external factors that they're going to come across when they get to the retirement phase. Start providing education on not exclusively retirement issues, healthcare, insurance, Social Security, things that they will need to understand and have comfort with to get to the retirement status, and highlight the effectiveness of their current behaviors. Encourage them for their savings rates. Unfortunately, the quarterly participant statements that so many of us receive focus on what the rate of return for the last quarter, the last year. How much did your retirement accumulations change? And those can change obviously dramatically. Everybody who got their 331 statement, unless you're really bad at investing, got really good news about their rate of return. However, what's really important is what the current savings rates and allocations and age and accumulations, the impact of those four variables on retirement income and retirement adequacy at age 65. That doesn't change dramatically. Even when we do have market downturns and changes, the savings rates and investing behaviors don't fluctuate dramatically from period to period. So hiding on those successful metrics that we think is important. And then access to additional personal education resources. So for those that do want to be educated, I think it's a critical benefit of education. Give them access to it in a way that they can digest it. And most important is this pre-retiree population. It is a tremendous leap of faith for those in the defined contribution setting to make the transition from accumulation to retirement income. And it's important to begin to bring what are the broad assumptions about retirement plan projections to a much finer point. So encouraging and providing resources for your pre-retiree population to take into account external assets, spousal income, spending needs, healthcare costs and resources, understanding the federal and state resources that will be available to them, allow them to gain the comfort necessary to make that change. As evidenced by the earlier point about return rates being impacted by the S&P 500 index, getting people comfortable is an important factor as to whether they will and are ready to retire, and helping them not retire if they're not ready to, but and whether they're ready to, we think is a critical piece of this education puzzle. Allow participants to get advice on how to secure and protect accumulated savings. We continue to hear from the Department of Labor, from the jury, from the Internal Service, interest about potentially getting higher level of annuitization among the employee population, but certainly doing so requires a lot of education, because as challenging as getting participants to save in a defined contribution plan may be, getting a participant to understand the costs, benefits, and risks of annuitization is far, far greater. And then help with that transition from accumulations to income, whether it's just income planning or allowing them to see what annuitization looks like, helping them understand that there are options beyond just having a big pile of money that they take out from month to month or week to week as may be necessary to meet their income objectives. So here we want a plan that's easy to start, leak-proof, and safe to leave. And to that point, we think that there are a few steps that plan sponsors need to take. And so the first is evaluating the current retirement readiness of your institution as a benchmark. Where today, and what do we need to do to get better? One of the things that we'll roll out this year is a plan-level assessment as to the retirement income status defined contribution plan. So if our 401k, 403b, 457 plan were a pension plan and not a defined contribution plan, would our funding status be, and how likely would it be that the plan as designed would generate the types of outcomes that we're looking for? What obstacles are there to getting our young employees participating in the plan? It's a tremendous challenge to address the gaps that are clearly when we look at our 45 to 65-year-old population, and maybe arguably our 55 to 65-year-old population. But certainly one of the first steps is to make sure that the next new hire doesn't face the same obstacles that our older workforce may have experienced during their accumulation years. Develop mechanisms to move those employees, and really all employees, towards adequate retirement income. So what level of save would be necessary given our demographics to get a large portion of our population to retirement adequacy? Goals, take a look at your loan policies. There is, again, evidence to support that having a loan plan has a material impact on participation rates and deferral rates. So at the very least, reducing the number of loans that participants can take, in some cases removing loan provisions where they don't make sense, can have a significant impact, back to that 0.5 to 0.75% drag on retirement assets that loan provisions have become. And then build a communication structure that's really there to support the objective. Education plans are not there to help employees buy 529 plans. They're there to necessarily explain the nuances of large cap growth investing versus TIPS investing. But having a education policy statement that's emphasized on savings rates, emphasized on generating outcomes, and provides employees the ability to get the types of pre-retirement planning that will be necessary and give them comfort that they'll be able to retire successfully, I think is important and critical. So I'm going to pause for a minute. Thank you for those of you who may need to